Right, so on to Plato and Aristotle. And as I said, I'm going to be keeping this rather brief. I'm just going to be drawing out particularly on Aristotle. You can have a look at what I say in the book about Aristotle, but it's horribly complicated and really difficult stuff. Plato's a bit easier. Um, there's Plato, of course. So notice that Plato lived. He didn't merely flourish. He lived, and so when we use the term flourish, it's because we're unsure of the dates. I mean, flourish means they're around about that time. Plato, we're more definite about the dates, so he lived in this time. Again, during the classical period in Greece, in Athens, things were going pretty well in Athens. There had been some trouble, but anyway, things were looking pretty good. Now, as I've said, he wrote these dialogues, and his work on time primarily occurs in the Timaeus, one of his dialogues, and it's a kind of a creation myth in there. It's very unclear whether Plato meant this to be a literal truth about how the universe came into existence. Probably not. I mean, the Greek relationship between myths were whether they weren't really supposed to be absolutely true, they were just meant to express certain truths, perhaps in a kind of a mythical way or something. But at any rate, the key idea in there about time, I think Plato did think was true, and we'll say what that is briefly. So, on Plato's view, the universe was created by a divine craftsman, demiurge. So, this divine craftsman created the universe, and from the chaos, so before the Earth or before the universe was created, the world was just in a total chaos. There were no sort of intelligible stuff. There was nothing that you could nothing you could say kind of had well, I'll use the term form. It's Plato's term, and the thought was what the demiurge did to create the universe was to use the forms in the Platonic heaven. So we spoke about this very briefly before in the very first video. The forms were meant to be the properties that things have, and they're meant to exist in a perfect form in this kind of separate realm, the realm of the forms. And what Demiurge did was he used those forms as his guide to create and lay down order onto the world. Right? So Plato's theory of the forms comes in here, and yeah, the Earth is created by laying down order onto chaos using the forms. That is, basically putting properties into the world. Now, there's a form for everything up in the Platonic heaven, more or less. So there's a form of beauty, there's a form of the red, there's this form of squareness, there's even forms of things like there's a form of the perfect table, there's a form of the perfect mug, there's a form of the perfect curry and cat and people and blah blah, everything you can think of, there's a form for it. Except there's no form for time. And this is a kind of key idea for Plato. Time doesn't exist, it's not a property, right? But nonetheless, time is introduced to the world by this divine craftsman demiurge in relation to the forms. So, exactly why, and what he says is, time is the moving image of eternity. So, it introduces further order into the world in relation to the forms, even though there isn't a form for time. So, what's going on here? I think it's an intelligible idea. I don't think it's plausible. I don't think it's true, but it's intelligible. And the idea here is meant to be, if you think about the Platonic forms, they're eternal. And actually, why don't we introduce this distinction now? So one of the key things that Plato did was to introduce these two types of eternity. The first type of eternity is a kind of going on forever and ever and ever, not having a beginning and not having an end and existing at all times. So, you might think about, suppose that, you might think about the universe itself like that. If it didn't have a beginning, it doesn't have an end. It's still true that it exists in time. It just exists at all times. So at every single time that you can think of, there it is, persisting and existing across the temporal dimension of time. And there might be some things that exist like that. If we think about Anaximander, for example, he thought that there were certain substances i.e. or a certain substance, namely a pyrrhon, which does exist in this way. It exists in an enduring sense. It exists through time. The second notion of eternity, then, is the idea of something that exists timelessly. That is, it doesn't exist in time at all. It's a kind of abstract thing, and it exists outside of time, but is still eternal in the sense that, it's never not existing. I suppose that introduces a temporal notion again, but I hope you can see that idea. It's not conditioned by time. It exists completely outside of the temporal realm, right? And that's the second sense. And that's the sense in which Plato thought the forms exist. They don't exist in time, they just exist eternally in this kind of, right? Think by analogy of the numbers. If numbers exist, 1, 2, 3, 4 and so on, then it's not like they exist anywhere in time, they're just abstract things that exist outside of time in some sense. So, the forms exist in that second sense of eternity. They are not conditioned by time and are therefore timeless. But time is introduced into the universe in order to represent that timelessness of the forms. Alright, so in order to understand exactly what's going on here, then what we need to do is to look at what he thought time actually was in the world. So here's a picture of the Platonic universe as he thought of it. And I told you that he had this idea that the Earth was in the centre. I told you, I think, a couple of videos ago. The Earth was in the centre of the universe, and then it was surrounded by this water, and then surrounded by air and fire, and then you got the planets. I think I said that the Sun and the planets were stuck in the outer sphere. They weren't quite right. They were placed before the outer layer of the universe, into which all the stars are then placed. I hope you can see. So yeah, this is kind of like the bound of the universe. So he didn't have this idea that, like Anaximander did, that there is a boundless, that it goes on forever and ever. He rather thought that it was bounded, and that's the kind of limit of the universe, and that's the way it is. So he had this thought that, and this is, I suppose, quite natural if you consider, if you've got this view of how the universe looks, and you notice that the stars, they remain pretty much fixed. So, if you look up into the sky from year to year, you get patterns of the stars move across the sky as the seasons pass and so on, but they always return to the same place each year. They are moving, but they move. We can't notice them moving across our lifetimes and across many lifetimes because we're talking about the galactic scale. But at any rate, if you've got this view of the universe, the natural thought is, well, as the year passes, these stars, or this outer sphere, revolves, and things return back to exactly how they were each year, right? And Plato did have this idea. He thought that the universe as a whole revolves and returns back to its exactly the same initial state every year. And then maybe I will go to my drawing board again to try to show you. I had to look up Aristotle's years to put them in. If I go back to my drawing board, so the thought here is, as the universe rotates and goes back to each individual, so imagine we draw a timeline again, and let's draw, this is now representing years, let's say, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we have the universe in its state, and let's just put in a couple of stars. Let's put that star there and that star there, and then halfway through the year they've moved over here. But by the time we get back to year 2, they've gone back to their initial state. By the time we get back to year 3, they've gone back to their initial state. Year 4, they've gone back to their initial state. Year 5, they've gone back. You get the idea. Then there's a certain sense in which you can divide these up. This is kind of like, these are units. Although there's change going on in between them, they're always repeating themselves one after the other after the other. And that's what Plato thought. He thought he thought that each one of these is kind of like a unit, and because as a whole they keep returning back to the same distribution, the same way, then there's a sense in which they go on forever and ever and ever and ever and ever and never change, and that was his idea. So time is these units of eternal recurrence. Things keep happening the same over and over and over again, and that's why, and that represents the timelessness of the forms in some sense, which can't change, right? So the fact that the universe, in a sense, never changes, i.e. keeps returning back to the same state eternally, in the sense of doing that over and over and over again, represents the timeless, eternal nature of the forms. So there's no form for time, but nonetheless, time is supposed to represent something about the forms. Okay, so that was Plato's view. That's all I'm going to say about that. Okay, so that's all I'm going to say about Plato, and I'm going to be probably maybe even briefer when it comes to Aristotle. So yes, I found his dates. I'd forgotten them, 384 to 322 BC. I'm not going to do much history now. I gave the history of the pre-Socratics because they're probably lesser well known. Anyway, I'm sure you know that Plato and Aristotle both lived in Athens during the sort of classical period. Plato formed a school. Aristotle formed his school there, the Lyceum. He left Athens after a while and became a tutor to Alexander the Great. And anyway, we're not going to talk about the history here. So, yes. Oh, and every time I come to Aristotle's view, it gives me this sort of a heavy heart because I don't understand it. Nobody does. So he says this: time is the number of motion with respect to before and after. That's his kind of headline idea about what time is. So the key thing that I want to illustrate with Aristotle, though, is the idea that time is a mind-dependent process. I'll come to that. So the idea is meant to be, and this is rough and ready, it seems to be that when changes occur, things move from an initial state to an end state through a continuous series of intermediate stages. So continuum here, the idea of a continuum is the idea that you can divide things up infinitely, as we just saw with the idea of Zeno. So there's you can keep dividing up time, and when things change from one state to another, so take a concrete example. Let's suppose you've got what can we have? You might be moulding a piece of clay into a statue. So it's changing from a lump of clay into a statue form. Well, to do that, the idea is you've got to change it from its initial lump state into its statue shape through a continuous series of changes. So you can, keep dividing up, and there's going to be infinitely many, in fact, intermediate states between the beginning and the end. And then his idea seems to be, well, time is to do with our measure of that change. And what we do is we can kind of split up that change into chunks, and it's the splitting up of the change into chunks which is what time is, but it depends upon the mind to actually do that. Alright, let's try and explain this again using my board. So let's take a particular change. Let's have the statue that we just spoke about. This could also be a motion. He talks about often in terms of motion, but remember, a motion is just a change in place over time. Here we're going to have a change. So this is not a change in place, but a change in. So we've got a lump of clay, and eventually, if we mould it into a statue, we get a beautiful statue. There we go. But the point is, between this initial state, initial state, and the end state, according to Aristotle, we get a bit where we begin to mould it, begin to change its shape a bit. I'll just keep sort of, like some horrendous. Anyway, we begin to sort of mould it a bit, getting an arm in there. You get the idea, right? So by the time we get to here, we've got more or less it's coming on, right? We've got like, there we go, and it's becoming. You get the idea. And the point being, there is going to be infinitely many. I've just drawn some representative stages, but there's going to be, we can keep dividing these up. There's going to be infinitely many different stages between the initial state and the end state. And Aristotle's thought is, well, if there's the continuum here, we can draw a line, which is the timeline, I suppose, but there's no sense in which it's got any kind of, it's just infinitely many stages amongst the timeline. But his thought was, well, we don't just think about it like that. What we do is we can kind of impose upon this, okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and so on. We can kind of impose an order upon this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And that's supposed to be this sort of cutting of the timeline, I suppose, or a cutting of these changes into discrete chunks or discrete units that we can measure. So it's something to do with the idea of measurement here going on. And his thought is, that's what time is. It's the mind-dependent cutting of this continuous timeline into these chunks so that we can kind of place some order onto things. Okay? So he thought that's what time is. It's this mind. It requires a mind. So without a mind, there's no sense in which we can divide this up in any way, non-arbitrarily. So it requires this mind. But he did have this idea that there are some changes which do seem to, and we can imagine this, right? Suppose you've got a wristwatch. There's a wristwatch with a quartz crystal in. A quartz crystal vibrates at a certain time, and tick, tick, tick. The clock will tick around like that. Right. And the thought is, we can take this change, which has kind of got these built into it, these sorts of 1 second ticks, and we can use that 1, 2, 3, 4. So we can use the change here to order the change here, although there's no real sense in which this is the objective order. It's just one particular type of change that we use to, right, as an aid for our mind to divide things up. All right, I'm not sure how clear that is. I think there's some sense in that, but it is difficult to understand, and I'm not going to try and do any better job than that, really. As I've said to you before, there are these 2 books available on time. I've forgotten who they're by now. One by a lady, one by a man, mentioned in the textbook. And if we go into any more detail, we're quickly going to run into real interpretive difficulties, because these 2 book-length treatments of Aristotle on time both reach completely different conclusions about what he's up to. And yeah, just so that you know, this idea of cutting a timeline, so imagine you've got the timeline and you introduce a cut into it, you count 1, right? In a sense, you've split that line up into two separate parts, right? There's the cut, which Aristotle calls the now. So the present moment, if you like, as experienced by us, is a place at which we could introduce a cut into the timeline. And that's what he calls the now. Alright, that's as best a sense as I can make of Aristotle. If you want to, go away, have a look what Aristotle says about time. The references are in the book. See if you can make any better sense of it than that. But good luck if you have a go. But I think it's a useful thing to do. Sometimes it's good to look at things that are hard to try and get your head around. So okay, we're done then. That's all I'm going to say about Plato and Aristotle. The key things to remember then are these about Plato and Aristotle. The one thing I want to draw out from Plato is the idea of these 2 types of eternity. That's the key thing to bear in mind. Timelessness versus existing forever. And, well, what's the key thing from Aristotle? The idea that time and counting according to regular types of some regular changes in the universe does seem to have something to do with time. I personally think it's more through not with time itself, but the measurement of time. But perhaps you think there's a closer link than that, and yeah, we can talk about that. All right. So, thanks very much. We're now going to move to our last person. I forgot his name earlier. It's Augustine. He's the last person that we're going to consider. So we're going to jump over a large portion of time from the Greeks now. So I suppose a bit of background here. After Aristotle, during the Middle Ages, during the later Greek period, then the Middle Ages, really, and this is very rough. So we're talking about the scholastic period after the Greeks sort of died away about 500 AD. But in the later Greek period and into the scholastic period, there wasn't really a lot. This is a vast oversimplification, but for our purposes, there wasn't a lot of novel work that went on. People largely were interested in elaborating on the work of Plato and Aristotle, and in the Middle Ages in Western Europe, particularly upon Aristotle. So, Christianity came in, and there was this attempt to sort of merge Aristotelian metaphysics and Christian doctrine. That's what the scholastics were really up to. So we're going to skip over a fair bit because there wasn't a lot of interest said until we get to Augustine. Okay, thanks.